Okay, hello, hey everyone, welcome back. Got something interesting for you today. Recently, I got to take a look at Dune Awakening, the upcoming Survival Sandbox MMO from Funcom. Been following this for a while as an enjoyer of both survival games and MMOs. I've been interested in seeing how this combo of the two genres turns out. Now, what we'll be looking at here today consists of roughly the first 4 to 5 hours of gameplay, which in either genre is admittedly not much, but hey, it's something. Running through the tutorial, doing some questing, gathering, crafting, and building, and my favorite stuff, checking out some of the open world content, including clearing enemy camps, running dungeons, and exploring a few different points of interest. So what I'm going to do in this video is simply take you through this early chunk of the game, actually letting you see what the opening hours are like, the things that you'll be doing, along with giving some of my initial thoughts. Now, right at the top, I will say, while I do like a lot of the structure and activities that are on display here, like the base foundation of this survival game, at the same time, I definitely have some early concerns, primarily around the combat, the overall clunkiness, the game's pacing, and top of it all is probably performance. Frankly, some of this is still a bit rough looking, a bit more than I would hope so as we get closer to development, but that said, it is still in development, and the hope is that they continue ironing things out prior to release, which is exactly the point of doing something like providing said early feedback. Okay, so the preface done, let us dive in. Here's what the first few hours look like in Dune Awakening. Now, of course, character creation is where it all begins. After picking a starter preset, you then get to tailor things however you please. They've got most of the expected sliders for body proportions, facial features, and then the coloring of everything. Really not much to say here, pretty straightforward stuff. The real choice begins when you start actually picking your backstory, where you were born, your caste, and your mentor, and this plays into more than just your character's history, coming with some gameplay related effects. Depending on what you pick, you'll unlock various dialogue traits, emotes, and your mentor choice will determine your starting class and skill. The Trooper is offensive and demolition with the Shigawire cable, which is basically a grapple hook. The Mentat is your recon and strategy class with a sentry turret. The Bene Gesserit Acolyte is a physical mastery and manipulation with the voice compel skill, which pulls targets towards you. And then lastly, there's the Swords Master, close quarters combat as you'd expect. They've got the deflection skill, which is a stance that will deflect ranged dart attacks against you. Now, it's worth noting that as you progress through the game, you'll eventually be able to unlock whatever skills, weapons, and tools you please. This just essentially gives you your starting baseline. Okay, so after this, you get a few cutscenes, you crash land on the planet, waking up inside of a cave, and this begins the tutorial. Almost immediately, you're going to find the Frem Kit, which acts as your mobile crafting station, letting you make some of the early game gear and tools while on the go. Your first objective is to craft a scrap metal knife. Once finished, it'll automatically be added to your hotbar. Then equipping it allows you to now slice through a nearby blockade. From here, you're introduced to some survival mechanics of dehydration, where you'll collect dew from water plants to fill up the bar. You'll make a health kit, which can be used to heal your character. This is crafted using basic plant fiber, and you'll scale a rock wall, as the game does have a free climbing system. Basically, as long as you have the stamina, you can climb pretty much anywhere in the environment. Upon exiting the cave and emerging onto the planet's surface, this introduces you to the second survival mechanic, which is sunstroke. So spending time in the sun will heat up your temperature, increasing your rate of dehydration. You'll want to try to find cover in buildings or in the shadows of rock formations to counteract that effect. Near the remnants of your recently crashed ship, you're going to get your first taste of combat, quite basic at this point. Unholstering the scrap metal knife that you made earlier lets you take down this lone guard, and then you're tasked with actually getting inside of the ship, which requires you to use a cutter ray to destroy a massive rock. Now, this cutter ray is your basic early game mining tool, so outside of the small objects that you can pick up directly with your hands, you're going to use this device to break down and collect larger ones. So first, what you do is you analyze an object by scanning it, which is then going to reveal a line of its structural weakness, which you then have to trace to cut along. Doing this properly will then reward you with bonus materials, which is just like a nice little additional twist onto the typical gathering systems. Inside of the ship, we get some additional basics of the combat mechanics. So you have the melee slash, which is essentially your basic attack. 3 hits in quick succession will stagger enemies, letting you deal additional damage while they're stunned. You also have a defensive dash ability to avoid incoming attacks, as well as a parry, which if timed properly will also stagger opponents. And then holding down your attack will perform a slow blade strike, which can be used to bypass enemy shields. Essentially this game's version of a heavy hit, just more themed for the Dune universe. Then a couple more cutscenes transitions you into the next section of Dune's intro tutorial. You've crashed once again, this time waking up in the middle of the desert, surrounded entirely by sand. And here's where you get your first peek at the sand worm. Now this is essentially just cinematic for now. It looks the same for everyone, but later on in the game, the worm actually becomes a real mechanic to contend with, as you have to watch your noise level while traversing the sands. Making too much noise will call a worm that can actually kill you. After this, we do a bunch of gathering, harvesting various resources, and you're given some beginner schematics teaching you how to craft a few early game items. Starting with the makeshift clothing set, which is made up of a jacket, hood, shoes, pants, and gloves. And I'll say this, I think it looks pretty cool for basic starter gear, not too bad. You're going to notice here as well with the crafting system that there is a queue. So long as you've got the resources, you can set up multiple items one after the other. They're going to craft automatically, then be dumped into your inventory and or onto your hotbar, letting you do other things while that crafting is taking place. Now, after the armor's made, it's time to make your first ranged weapon and a few tools. From here on out, you're tasked with making an improvised mala pistol, light darts for ammunition, binoculars to scout and tag enemies, and a respawn beacon, which does exactly as the name implies. These are pretty important to place strategically, especially when you're coming up against what could be a deadly situation, as dying in this game drops everything in your backpack, which you need to retrieve manually in typical survival game fashion. So walking around and gathering for a few minutes should be pretty much enough to give you the necessary resources. And then with all of this new stuff made and equipped, you can now scout a nearby scavenger camp and eliminate its enemies, which has always been just some of my favorite, albeit basic types of content in survival games. I love going in enemy camps, clearing out all the opponents, and then collecting all the loot. It's an enjoyable process. I've liked it since the early Far Cries. I continue to really enjoy it. Now you'll notice here in the combat section that we have a sentry turret in this footage, having started as the Mentat class. This does what you expect. You'll place it down, it'll shoot at enemies within range and in line of sight. After killing some of the enemies, we gain enough XP leveling up, and then at this point, you get a skill point to spend in whichever tree you please. So every class has 3 sub-trees, each with multiple active and or passive abilities, many of which even have multiple levels you can invest in. Now you can pick from whatever tree you please, even not as your starting class as you progress, because as mentioned, your starting class just gives you that initial baseline. All right, so picking up the shield wall as our second skill here, this gives us a nice early defensive option, especially useful if caught out in the open without cover. After this, your next objective is building a basic shelter, which requires the salvaging of a whole bunch of metal. Now, while gathering and looking around for this, you'll actually notice we come across a few booby traps here with these mines placed right next to chest, which if not dealt with ahead of time would have exploded should you ran up straight away to loot them. After some more gathering and a few combat encounters, you're going to finally likely have enough metal to build your construction tool, which opens up the initial early stages of base building. And this system works as follows. So first you place down a sub-fief. This is essentially your buildable space, the area in which you can place your building. Then with the resources you've gathered thus far, you're going to want to place down a foundation, walls, doors, a roof, and when fully enclosed, you've got yourself a nice starter shelter, which should help protect you from some of the environmental stuff, which we'll touch on in a moment. From there, you're going to want to place down some of the initial crafting and refining stations, which will be used for the next tier of building items and components, things that you can't craft in your on-the-go Frem kit. So for example, we'll early on be building a small storage container, a fuel power generator, which is used to give your base an actual shield, and a blood extractor and purifier for an alternate form of hydration beyond finding water in the environment. Base building is pretty straightforward, but also seems well done. I don't need constructing a building to be overly complex. I also like that they seem to have quite a variety of options for how you build your base, even early on in the game. I mean, the fact that you can toss up a building as big as what you're seeing here in like under an hour, I think that's pretty nice. With all the base stuff finished, we're then introduced to the game's magic-like system of spice-induced hallucinations. So on our way to our first trial to unlock this power, we actually get a glimpse of some of the game's dynamic weather, and this is what I was talking about, how you need an enclosed base. This comes in the form of these massive dust storms. You'll see here, you got this cloud system rolling in over the horizon, and with it comes a huge sandstorm that you have to take shelter from. Apparently, these storms will be dynamically rolling through the servers, moving throughout the open world on a consistent basis. It's just another thing for you to contend with. And you can also see here the game's system of nighttime patrols. These are security ships that will scan the surface of the planet, and if you happen to get spotted in one of their spotlights, it's like triggering an alarm. They're going to call down combat troops to apprehend you, at which point you'll have to fight them back or be apprehended. Now, en route to the first trial, come across a couple of things like a downed ornithopter, and using the cutter ray, you can see you can actually disassemble this piece by piece, breaking it down for its materials, while sticking to the shadows that are created by these rock formations, which is something you're going to have to do to avoid that sunstroke. In doing this, we encounter a few more scavenger camps, just little small areas with a couple of enemies to clear and a chest or two to loot. Now, eventually, after doing this for a while, we arrive at our destination. Located inside of a cave, it is this underground ruin. Sniffing the spice found at an altar, we then pass out, stepping into the dream world, and it is here that we have to complete our first trial, the Trial of AQL. So this consists of what is essentially a traversal puzzle. You have to make your way through this environment, leapfrogging between pillars, walls, and other sorts of rock formations, trying to avoid the gaze of these massive floating eyeballs. There's some narrative stuff in here as well, with you seeing the hallucinations of these NPCs talking. Upon completing the course, you are then rewarded with a brand new spice-based ability. So when exposed to enough spice, either seeing it, coming across it in the world, or by consuming it directly, you will fill up a bar, and eventually, once full, you will enter what is called the prescient state. This unlocks a third skill for you to use. It reduces your ability cooldowns, letting you use them more often. It also increases your damage and grants you immunity to poison, which all sounds pretty good, right? Yes, but there is a drawback, because after entering the prescient state, once it fades, you then experience spice withdrawal, during which you cannot consume any more spice, and your tolerance increases, making it take longer to fill up your bar next time. Now, this tolerance over time will eventually decrease, and it's basically a balance that you have to decide between, about letting your spice tolerance drop down or consuming a bunch of spice as soon as possible and getting even more tolerance, making it take longer to fill up the next time around. It's going to be like a consistent play of balance there. All right, so we've unlocked the prescient state, our first spice power, and then we head out to do a bit more exploring, collecting loot, scouting out the early game sandworm, which essentially is rather static early on but becomes a lot more dynamic as we progress through the game, so I've been told. After that, we move into the next tier of the crafting system, building ourselves a fabricator, which then allows us to make a still suit. So this is your next tier of armor, but it also provides some additional survival benefits, mitigating hydration loss on top of providing additional water storage on the go. After the still suit, we then build a survey probe launcher, and this actually lets you scan a wide area, marking nearby valuable resources within its range. Those resources will then actually show up on your map when you pull it up, as well as your HUD whenever using your binoculars. And then the next objective we're given is to locate and head to a nearby trade post. So this is basically a tiny little town, a little outpost in the wilderness where you're going to interact with NPCs, collect various quests, and can buy yourself some useful items. Also at the trade post, you might happen to run into other players as well, which you can then group up with to take on some of the game's more challenging content. One such example is this game's version of dungeons known as the testing stations. So there's an early game one not actually too far from the trading post. After clearing enemies outside and just beyond the entrance, you eventually make your way down further into the facility, and this is probably some of my favorite stuff that I've seen in this game so far. These are rather large, more elaborate locations with a relatively big number of enemies for you to take on. You got lots of hallways and corridors to clear with enemies all throughout, lots of loot to be found, and some storytelling elements. It's been said in the past that they consider these stations less like traditional MMO dungeons and more akin to the sort of dungeons or vaults that you're going to see in Skyrim or Fallout shelters. That's essentially the type of experience they're looking to deliver. Big points of interest, more elaborate, lots of enemies, lots of storytelling, and lots of loot. That's the whole idea. And yeah, this is some of the content that I've seen so far in this game that I really enjoy the most. I also really like the visual diversity that these offer, as they are underground and a lot of science-based stuff is woven into them. They essentially have their own ecosystem, which you can actually see that variety here with all of the tropical plants and stuff, which is a stark difference to all of the sands above. Other stuff I saw I wanted to point out here was the placing down of a thumper in the sands that lets you call the sandworm, because again, the more noise you make, it will draw the worm. So this can actually be used as a tool to distract the worm for a short while, letting you run past them if there's like a valuable area or spot you're trying to get to that the worm would otherwise prevent you from accessing. Also, the building of a sandpike. So this is actually used to leave the earlier zones at the southern part of the world and head into like proper Haga Basin, which is apparently where the game is said to really open up with a lot more variety of points of interest and things to do and see. However, unfortunately, that was not something that we've seen on display as of yet. And that actually pretty much wraps up our overview of what we saw here in those initial hours. Now I want to move on to some of my early thoughts and feedback. Starting with the likes, as mentioned, I really like clearing enemy camps and dungeons. It just seems like something I'm going to really enjoy in the full-blown version of the game. Going in, taking out enemies, scouting them first, taking out enemies, coming in from different angles, using our abilities, doing that sort of stuff with friends. It seems like it's something that I'm going to have a lot of fun with. I like their survival mechanics as well. A lot of the traditional base survival game stuff, but they've also got like the avoiding of the sun so you don't overheat. They've got the having to stay hydrated, which is also partially tied into the sun system. They got the fact that beyond just picking up items, you were gathering with this cutter ray, which has like what's basically like a mini game of you having to trace the structural weaknesses of the integrity of the item. I think that's kind of neat. I thought the base building seems good. It's simple, but rather well done. I also enjoy some of the little twists and flourishes that they've made to fit a survival game into the Dune universe, like your Fremkit backpack, the still suit, replacing what is normally heavy attacks with a slow attack to pierce enemy shields, and some of the environmental threats like the sandstorms that roll in or the ever-present threat of the sandworm. That stuff is really neat. I also like the patrolling security ships. That's really cool to see as well. And that the game has these different vehicles that eventually we're going to have access to, starting with the sand bike, eventually moving up to the ornithopter, and then some of the larger scale spice harvesting vehicles that we will eventually be getting. In terms of the feedback and the stuff that I think needs work, right at the top, performance. Holy crap. Early on, it seems very rough. As you have no doubt seen yourself watching this gameplay, performance is a major pain point as of now. Currently, it's actually my biggest concern. Like, if this game runs poorly at launch, that'll probably be enough to get a lot of people to quit. If it runs like this for me, I don't know how long I could stomach it. Like, I'm one of those people who literally gets seasick if like performance is too bad. Like, that impairment, it just doesn't work for me, makes me feel nauseous. So if performance isn't at least relatively smooth, I'm probably not playing your game. Another major lingering concern here that's pretty obvious looking at the gameplay is that there's still clearly quite a lot of jank here. We're talking clunky looking animations, particularly in combat and especially with the melee system. It does not look really good. Now, last time we got a glimpse of gameplay in the prior video coverage that we did, it was stated that this was like an initial iteration of their melee system. It's one of the newest things that they've been working on. They saved it for last, or so we're being told. Hopefully that's true, and hopefully it looks better at release, because yeah, it doesn't look amazing here. It's certainly not anything that I would call fluid. Speaking of combat, it also seems rather slow just across the board. Now, maybe this is just the result of this being in the early game. I will leave them room for the fact that things could pick up as you get more skills, as you get better melee and ranged weapons, as you unlock more talents in your skill tree, as you get better gear. Maybe all of this speeds up the pacing of combat, but at the baseline, in particular the melee combat, it's like it's moving at a snail's pace. It's just very slow looking. And then lastly, I just want to note that I didn't get the chance to see a ton of open world stuff. Like, not a lot of different points of interest in these initial hours. It seems that the whole thing here is rather quite linear. Now, that is supposedly something that changes post getting the sand bike, because you start with a tutorial and then you move into Southern Haga Basin, and I've been told that this is like still considered like an extension of the tutorial. It's after getting the sand bike and leaving Southern Haga Basin into that main Haga Basin region, that is where the game is actually supposed to open up. It's supposed to get a lot more variety of stuff, a lot more public events, a lot more different points of interest, a lot more different testing stations, just a lot more of everything, which unfortunately we just didn't get the chance to see in these early hours of gameplay footage. So we just have to, at this point, keep our fingers crossed that we get more variety and more interesting things to see and explore after that region. Now, all that said, I am pretty used to survival games being janky. It's in fact more typical than not in this genre. It's not exactly known for super fluid combat. There's a lot of survival games I really enjoy. Almost ubiquitously, they have janky elements to them and rough edges. But regardless, I would want to see some further improvements to what is on display here. Now, they did inform us, as you probably expect, that this is still a work in progress build and things should be improving at release, although of course that's the case, because when isn't it the case that for a game that's still in development and hasn't launched that it's not a work in progress build, right? The question is, do they have enough time to make the improvements that we're hoping to see prior to the game coming out? As always, it's just a wait and see. We'll have to see once the game launches. Being honest, does it look janky? Yes. Is performance quite bad looking? Absolutely. Does it have quite a few rough edges? No question. Do I think I could still have a whole lot of fun, especially with friends? 100%. Absolutely. Like, these open world sandbox games can be a total blast if they get enough things right, which is once more something we will just have to wait and see once the final product is in our hands. So there you have it, a look at the early game of Dune Awakening along with my initial thoughts and feedback. I am still going to be waiting until we really dive in and get to play a substantial chunk of the game. Like, once I have 40, 50, 60 plus hours, at that point I will come back with a more thorough and thought out review. I do have some early concerns as discussed here, but overall, I mean, hey, I can't deny that I am looking forward to jumping in, playing with my mates, and seeing what the game has to offer, especially further along beyond these initial 5 or so hours as we get into the proper open world of Haga Basin, and then further than that, moving into the deep desert where the large-scale battlefield-inspired, planet-side-inspired PvP is supposed to be happening. We've just not seen so much of this game so far. We know that the game doesn't run well. We know it's got some janky, rough edges, and that parts of combat don't really look good. If they get enough of the other stuff right, and if they can continue to polish and fine-tune those things, could work. Certainly, I'm gonna give it a shot, no question. I love survival games. They're almost always janky to some degree, portions of them. I love MMOs. This game's supposedly gonna have some large-scale PvP conflicts and PvP zones and all sorts of dynamic events, and like, there's still a lot to be answered here, still a lot of questions, and hoping to find out sooner rather than later. But that's it for today. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you next time. Take it easy.